Chapters 21 and 22. There's a major storm going on outside, so if you hear lots of thunder and heavy rain, that's what's going on. We'll see how the recording goes. I hope that our connection doesn't get interrupted. So, Chapter 21, the spring and the tunnel.
I said I would see you at Jerusalem. But how? Keep your voice down. This guard can't hear, but others may.
He's asleep? Taharka was astounded. Assyrian guards did not sleep.
Asleep as deep as Sheol, said Amos grimly.
He looked a little puzzled.
There was something strange about that. It seemed to me that he fell before I struck him.
But for the moment, Taharka could only think of the amazing fact that Amos was here, his friend. I'm glad you're here, no matter how, he said. And he added in a kind of wonder, I have been so alone. Amos glanced around the tent, the cushions, the sheepskins, the lingering odor of the food that had been brought for Taharka's evening meal.
This doesn't look like a prison.
It's a prison, said Taharka bitterly. Amos, what have you done? You were out of the trap. Now you've walked back into it.
Crawled back in,
Amos corrected him, brushing off a burr.
And I have not come to walk into a trap. I have come to get you out of this one and into another.
He put his hands on the boy's shoulders, shaking him a little.
Are you listening, Haru? I have come to take you into Jerusalem. I have come to take you to my king.
The tent was very quiet. Taharka did not move. Amos stepped back, as if chilled. He looked again around the tent, then back at Taharka, his eyes now puzzled and uncertain.
Are you listening?
Taharka spoke at last. I was thinking of Hermes, he said. It was as if someone else had spoken. He was as surprised as Amos to hear the words, but in his mind was the echo of other words, his own words, spoken to Sabi, the Mukri boy. Hermes is a Nile donkey, a royal donkey. He doesn't serve the Assyrians. He must not serve the Assyrians.
Yes, I am listening.
I think that's actually Taharka, sorry. Yes, he said, I am listening. What do we have to do? Even as he spoke, Amos watched him closely with that considering, uncertain look.
There are no stars,
he said, and not far from the outer wall of the city, if we can reach it, is a spring of water. From there, he stopped.
What have the Assyrians offered you, Great One? Your life?
That and more, thought Taharka, but he answered only, for a price. I don't want to pay that price.
I can promise you nothing,
said Amos.
In spite of all, I believe that Jerusalem will be delivered. Remember the omen of the sun? But I cannot ask you to believe it. And beyond that...
It doesn't matter, said Taharka. If I believe it or not, I will not serve the Assyrians. Amos let out his breath in a long sigh.
Good,
he said.
Then get rid of that rich robe, young hawk. It will hamper your wings.
To the east of the city, not far, as Amos had said, from the great wall, was a spring of water, the pool of Gihon. Here the people of Jerusalem had always come out to descend the steps cut into the rock and gather their precious supplies of water. Sealed inside their walls by the Assyrian patrols, they could not come out now. Jerusalem's water supply had been cut off. It must be very low, the Assyrians had thought, if not exhausted. And, since in the short run water was even more necessary than food, they had begun to wonder. 2 soldiers guarded the spring just in case. Amos and Taharka, inching their way over the rough ground, shielded by the dark of the night, watched the 2 men in the light from their fire, passing and repassing. Taharka was armed with a sword. He had taken it from the guard who lay where he had fallen, outside the tent. And now Taharka knew watching the distant gleam of the two men's armor, that this time there would be need for killing.
His stomach tightened. He had been trained for battle. Once, long ago,
To save a life, he had killed a beast. But a man? And why? Why had Amos brought him here? This was no road to the city.
Amos said only, "You will see. You will see the wisdom of my king." Now he whispered, "After this, no talk. So listen carefully. We slide the rest of the way. Slide, not crawl, like snakes, until we come to light from their fire. Then, when I give the signal, we are up and upon them. I take the big one, you take the other."
Taharka had not been taught to slide or crawl upon the ground. Such training had not been thought necessary for a god. Amos, on the other hand, had been trained in the old ways of his people, the ways of the desert. He did indeed move with the ease and swiftness of a snake. For a moment, Taharka thought he could not keep up with him. His heart bursting, he struggled in the wake of his friend, hardly noticing the scrapes on elbows and arms and knees in his desire to do his part.
They had reached the edge of the circle of light. For a moment they lay prone, regaining their strength. The bigger, older sentry said something to the younger one, who did not reply. Taharka thought that the man's steps were somehow uneven, not the steady, dogged tramp of the older man. But he had no time to think about it. Amos's hand was on his arm, his voice hissing in his ear. Now! They were up and into the light from the fire. Suddenly, Taharka was very calm. There was a job to be done. He knew how to do it, and he was doing it. The guards were trained for surprise, and their swords were in their hands. Still, the sudden attack was a shock, and they were at the first disadvantage. Taharka's man sprang back, staggering a little, and for a moment the boy thought he had him right at the start. But the man was a skilled swordsman, and Taharka's blow was parried, jarring the youth back. The Gar followed up on his advantage, and Taharka's foot struck a rock. He was falling. He rolled on the ground just beyond the deadly downward thrust that would have pinned him to the earth. Mbuta's voice rang in his ears. "Too slow, little nephew. Move your sacred back." And he was on his feet again, running right at his adversary. But the guard was quick. His sword was free and in play again. Iron clashed on iron, clashed and slid, and the tall, slight youth and the shorter, burlier man were locked in a test of strength that must surely go against Taharka. There was a cry of agony. Amos made his kill, and then, so suddenly that the Cushite youth was thrown off balance, Taharka's man reeled back. As the boy watched, unbelieving, the sword wavered in the young guard's hand, then fell. His face was a strange grayish color, and though Taharka's sword had not grazed him, he collapsed upon the ground. Taharka approached him, his sword half at the ready. He felt Amos's hand on his shoulder. "Let him be. There's no need." Completely confused, Taharka stammered, "He's sick. Something's wrong with him. I should..." "In the name of the Almighty One, you're not a physician now. You're an escaped prisoner, and this man would be your pursuer. Come, this is not the time." Half dragged, stumbling and bewildered, Taharka was forced away by his friend. The torches of the guards had fallen on the ground, and at first the boy could not see where they were going. Then Amos took one of them up and raised it high, and he saw that they were approaching the spring. "What are you doing? Where are you taking me?" "Quiet. Trust me. We are going into the city." A flight of steps cut into the rock led down into the well. Amos stepped down onto the topmost step. "Follow. Be quick." Down they crept till the cold, clear water of the spring lapped at their feet. "Can you swim?" said Amos. "Of course." Mbuta had taught him that too, along the green banks of the river so far, far away. But why?
Jerusalem does not lie at the bottom of a pool." "Follow me," said Amos, "but not too close. I must keep the torch burning." Into the water, so cold at first, then almost warm against the chill air of the night. Amos trod the water, holding the torch high above his head, casting light and shadows against the wall of the rock. And then they saw it, half submerged, half open, a great gaping hole in the rock. "It's here," hissed Amos. There was a note of relief in his voice.
"What is?" "When my king destroyed the altar to the god of Nineveh," whispered Amos, "he knew there was the chance that Jerusalem would come under siege. That was when he built the outer wall to the south. And inside that wall, here, hold the torch." Taharka took the brand, treading swiftly, fearful of dousing the precious light. Amos clambered onto the edge of the hole, retrieved the torch, and moved back. "Come," he said, and there was a strange, hollow, echoing sound to his voice. Taharka followed him, his feet slipping against the wet stones. Once he was sure of his footing, he tried to stand straight but found he could not. But he could stand half stooping, peering ahead into what the light from the torch revealed. It was a long, low passageway leading ever downward, through which the water from the spring gurgled and rushed, rising as high as their hips. "Come," said Amos again, and, holding the torch ahead of him, led the way into the passage. "Inside that wall," he said, as if he had not been distracted. "He dug a hole lined with rock. The Pool of Siloam, we have called it. It was no pool when I left my country for yours, just a dry ditch, but already the tunnelers had begun boring through the rock under the wall. The tunnel was to end here at the spring of Gihon, and the Pool of Siloam was to be fed from here. When I heard how long the city has been cut off from the water of Gihon, I knew it must have been completed. The Assyrians have barred the people from food, but not from their water." Ever downward led the tunnel. Taharka's neck and back ached. The cold, wet tunic clung to his body. The precious water swirled and rushed about his legs. Yes, this Hezekiah was a wise king, a king with foresight. He had kept his people alive. For what? To die on the stakes? Or in the slave coffles of the Assyrians? The tunnel led on into the darkness. To what else did it lead but the darkness of death? Not far down the way, the passage curved, still cutting into the rock. "Why has he done this?" said Taharka, and the walls seemed to echo. "Why has he done this? Why did they not cut straight through?" "The tomb of David lies in this rock," said Amos. "My king would not disturb his grave." David, the warrior king, a king who had made his people one and strong, a king remembered for 300 years. Who would remember Taharka? Indeed, after tomorrow, who would remember David? They had come to the end of the waterway. "This is it," said Amos, "the Pool of Siloam. And see, no longer a bed of dried mud. See, flowing with the life-giving waters from Gihon. How they must have wondered, the Assyrians. We must swim again, Hawk. Douse the torch. We have no more need of it. We're here." A low rock wall rose above the pool. They swam to the steps and climbed to the top. For a moment, the joy of Amos's homecoming infected even Taharka. Then he looked around him. A little warren of streets, like any other town, leading to a main entrance and a wider street that disappeared into the darkness. Where were the torches? Where were the people milling about the arcades, savoring the night air? Silence. He had never known a city so silent. "They will stay tonight behind the walls of their houses," said Amos. "They will cling to their families. They will pray. Before dawn, they will come out. They will come again to the wall, but this time they will come with their weapons in their hands." Something was stirring not far away. A child was crying, a fretful, whining wail. A woman, little more than a girl, was feebly trying to fill a water jug. The child clung to her robe. A woman of Jerusalem, one of the people he had seen that day on the wall. This time he could see clearly. Horror turned him cold. He had seen terrible sights, but not like this. It was as if two skeletons from his old anatomy class had come to life, just barely, and were trying to drink. He started to his feet. Amos laid a hand on his shoulder. "They are dying of hunger. Can you cure that, doctor?" "I can help her fill her jug." But the woman had managed it herself. She and the child slipped away into the shadows. "Come," said Amos. "I will take you to my king." Chapter 22. The Mad King.
The hill rose high above the city. On it stood the high house of the king and the temple of their god, where all could see. Taharka remembered from the stories in Napata that a king named Solomon had built them and encased them with gold. They weren't very big, mostly of brick, shored up with wood like the houses of ordinary people along the Nile. The temple especially had a shabby look, a look of disrepair. As for the gold, it had been there, and some of it was left, but most of it had been stripped away. Tribute for the Assyrians or some other king, he assumed. Soldiers of Judah patrolled outside the house of the king. Not very many, and they were far from the smart guards of the temple complex in Thebes. There were torches here, and Amos stepped into the light. He was a well-known figure in the city. Many hopes had been pinned on him. Taharka, hooded and hidden in the shadows, heard the whispers, rising into a babble of voices. "Amos ben Neriah? The ambassador? He's back. How can it be? How did he get in?" "Is there news? Is there hope? The Egyptians, the Cushites, is there any hope?" Then all discipline collapsed. They pressed in on him, hands reaching out to touch him, eyes searching his face, hungry for hope. One last hope for life. Taharka saw the pain in Amos's face. He was back, but his hands were empty. He had brought them nothing, thought Taharka bitterly. But Taharka himself, a refugee, a helpless exile, the Assyrians' pet pharaoh. A figure had appeared in one of the high windows that rose above the porch. "Soldiers of Judah!" It was the man, Eliakim, the head of the king's household, the thin, worn old man who, with trembling courage, had faced the Rabshakeh and refused the lion, his prey. "Back to your posts, captain! Control your men!" Amos drew closer and raised his hand in greeting. As in the long-ago audience room in Thebes, Taharka could see that he was close to exhaustion. "Eliakim." "Amos ben Neriah." The old man had raised his hands in wonder. His voice shook. "Let them pass. Come in, Amos. Come to the house of the king." It was big enough after all. The high, heavy wooden pillars cast long shadows that shielded Taharka from the eyes of the soldiers. But when they had passed the men and mounted to the long porch, when old Eliakim came hurrying down along the cedar columns to meet them, Taharka let the cloth fall away from his face. At first Eliakim did not notice. In trembling haste as he approached the ambassador with trembling arms, he embraced him. "Amos ben Neriah, I give thanks for your safety." He drew back, holding the ambassador at arm's length. Like the soldiers, he gazed upon the face of Amos. Like the eyes of the soldiers, his eyes begged for hope. "Is there any hope? Did you bring us hope?" Then, in the light of the torches, he saw the face of Taharka. He remembered from outside the wall. The Cushite boy, Pharaoh, the captive king of Egypt. How or why, he did not know, or at that moment care. He only knew that this was all Amos had brought him. He only knew that there was no more hope. He straightened, dignified and respectful, the head of the king's household. I will take you to Hezekiah the king.
They waited in a reception room in the royal apartments outside a little office. The king was working late that night, but that was the only sign of anything unusual. Eliakim had gone in before them to inform the king, and there was a hum of voices through the open door. Taharka had a strange feeling. It was somehow like the time he had waited with Talos outside the little surgery in Thebes to be interviewed by Baku. Eliakim came out of the office.
He will receive you now. He is very busy, you know. He is working on the plans to improve the grain depots.
Busy? Plans to improve the grain depots in a city about to be destroyed? Taharka felt a little dizzy. A madman! He was about to be presented a madman! With real apprehension, he followed Amos into the office. A secretary was rolling up his papyrus, gathering up his writing tools. He looked unhappy. The other man, resting on cushions, was talking softly, urgently.
And you make it plain to Nahum, the sheds face south.
Yes, Lord, but he isn't going to like it. He doesn't have to like it. Who is king here? And who's the carpenter? If... The shadows fell across the light. The man on the cushions raised his eyes. Then, slowly, he rose to his feet. The mad king. He was not very big either, not very young, but his eyes were the eyes of a young man. He wore a robe of some kind of coarse cloth, but the bands on his arms were of gold. He turned to the secretary, and for a moment his eyes were only for the younger man. He laid his hands on his shoulders. "You can go, Chilon," he said. "It's enough now. You go get some sleep." Nothing else was said, but in those few words the game they had been playing was over. They were two friends saying goodbye, probably forever. There were tears in the eyes of the young scribe as he bowed himself from the room. The king watched him go. Somber-eyed, he drew shut the door. Then he turned back and spread his arms wide. "Amos ben Neriah!" The two men embraced like brothers. "So you made it back, Amos. I expected you would. I can guess how." His eyes sparkled like the eyes of a boy looking for praise. "How did you light my tunnel?" "It was wet, my lord." And they laughed together, like conspirators. "Yes," said Hezekiah, "I thought it was a good idea. All these weeks the Assyrians must have been very puzzled. So you're back, and you have brought me Pharaoh, king of Egypt." Taharka stood straight and still as the little king of Judah looked him over with his bright, curious eyes. Hezekiah glanced at Amos. "The real thing?" he said. "The real thing." And Hezekiah became the courteous monarch, greeting a fellow ruler. "Pharaoh, welcome." He gestured downward to his rough robe. "Forgive the sackcloth." He made a wry face. "Goatskin. Not the most comfortable, but I have been to the temple to pray, and there was no time to change. And after all, I come from a family of shepherds." Taharka found himself laughing. "My grandfather was a boat builder. I would offer you food, but it seems the last of it is gone." Hezekiah spoke as if this were just some minor annoyance. He gestured them to the cushions and drew up a chair for himself. "So," he said, "welcome to our city. You have courage to come here." He added dryly, "Some would call it something else." Two mad kings, thought Taharka. But he said only, "I had no place else to go." "I'm sure there were other choices. We saw one of them yesterday at the wall. How did you get away from them?" He listened with interest as Taharka and Amos recounted the escape. When they told of the death of the guard, the strange collapse of the sentry at the spring, his face sobered, his eyes became intense. "Strange," he said softly. "Strange, like an omen, like a prophecy." There was a pause, and then he asked, "But how did Pharaoh come to be here and not with his army? How were you captured?" Briefly, Amos sketched the story of the last few weeks. The death of the taster, the escape from the great house in Thebes, Shabbataka's treachery, the crossing of the desert. At the end, Hezekiah commented, "So, they let you down through a window, like our King David. It seems it's as well for kings to have strong legs." His interest prompted Taharka to speak. He was telling Hezekiah more and more, things he had almost forgotten. Hezekiah was fascinated by the story of Baku and his patients, of Taharka's trials as a physician's apprentice. "I would have liked that. What an opportunity for a young man born as you were born. Do you realize your good fortune?" And at the story of the healing of Sabi, "Why, that's what they did for me when I was so ill from a boil. Is it really a remedy from a horse?" He shouted with laughter. Then he turned sober. That illness, that healing, there was something strange about that. His gaze again became intense. Something wonderful. For some reason, Taharka felt a tingling along his spine. Yahweh, our God, told the prophet, the man called Isaiah, that I would die of this illness. But the people had great need of me, and I prayed to Yahweh to be merciful to them and to me. And you see, I am still alive. He sent me a sign, a great one." "Yes," whispered Taharka, "I remember. The earth trembled and the shadow on the sundial moved back. The sun moved back." "So you saw it." A God of mercy, thought Taharka. A God who could heal a king by moving back time? But had Hezekiah been saved from illness only to die by the hand of the Assyrians? They fell silent. Hezekiah said at last, "What a life you have had! What choices you have been offered! What choices may still lie ahead!" He looked at him, as if searching for something behind his eyes. "What is it you want?" What did he want? He wanted to live, that was what he wanted, and it seemed that that was what he could not have. The sky through the windows was not so dark now. Dawn would come soon, the last dawn he would ever see. Still, Hezekiah's eyes compelled him to think. "I don't know," he said at last. "To live as a man, maybe, just a man. To walk among people." He thought, "Just to laugh with my friends, to find work again, to help and to heal." That, or the double crown of the two lands. The docks at Napata, the black mud of the Nile, Shepneset, all of these came with the double crown. "But it was given to me by chance," he thought, "and taken away again. I cannot have it back. Unless," and he thought of the words of the Rab Shakah, "I serve the Assyrians." The sky outside the windows was turning red and gold. Suddenly he was angry. What were they talking about anyway? Was this man really mad? Really a fool after all? Was this man... Ugh! He looked into Hezekiah's eyes and said what none of them had spoken before. "I don't really have to make choices, do I? After tomorrow, after today, it won't really matter." I don't know," said Hezekiah in turn. "Our God has promised Isaiah we will be delivered from the Assyrian." "He will return the way he came," he said. "He will not come into the city." Then the king of Judah smiled. "That choice is Yahweh's, to save or to destroy. But as for me, one way or another, I will not serve the Assyrians." "Nor will I," said Taharka, and he knew he meant it, even if somehow he survived what was to come. My lord the king." It was the old man Eliakim, and the sky now was pale. "My lord, you must come." The king of Judah rose slowly from his chair. No more talk, no more plans for the future. The time had come. Taharka, too, had risen, and now in his mind there was room for only one thought. This is the day of my death. Neither of them noticed the face of Eliakim.
It was not the face of a man contemplating the end. There was a puzzled look in his eyes, a look almost of excitement. He had come from the wall, and he had seen something strange.